Today on Don's Cobra Show, I rebuilt a Jaguar IRS hub. A lot of Cobra replicas are running the Jaguar independent rear suspension, and a lot of people get intimidated by rebuilding that rear suspension, especially these hubs from what I'm told. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I'm doing as I rebuild my hubs. However, I've never done this before, so if I'm doing something stupid, feel free to leave it in the comments, feel free to correct me. Save the next guy from doing something stupid. We're going to do this in two parts. We have the hub itself with your wheel bearings, and we have the outer fulcrum shaft assembly. You're going to disassemble the wheel bearing, you can disassemble the outer fulcrum shaft assembly, you're going to assemble the wheel bearings, you're going to reassemble this outer fulcrum shaft assembly. Now, step one of all of this is going to be using a press to push the hub out of the carrier itself. What I'm going to use, because I have one on hand, is this snap-on 1 1/8 inch deep well impact socket. It's a 1/2 inch drive, and it works. It fits just about perfectly. As you can see, here's the socket, and it's gonna press that hub out. I have the hub securely placed in the press. We're gonna bring the socket in right here. Now that we have our hub in two pieces, the carrier and the hub itself, we have to take this bearing off, and there might be other ways to get this job done without the bearing splitter, but I would recommend just trying to find a cheap one, or, you know, go to your local auto parts store, see if they'll let you borrow one. Pretty handy tool to have when it comes to stuff like this. Got a nice gap that we can get a puller in on now. I'm just going to take a stack of washers, put it on the top of the hub, so my bearing puller has something to actually pull on. Now what we're left with is the inner bearing and the two races and a seal. And it's the inner bearing and the seal. Now, there's two little grooves cut on the inside of this hub, and you can pretty much get a punch right in them and lock the seats back and forth. It's a good idea before you put an aluminum hub in a steel vise to protect the hub somehow by padding the jaws down. If you have leather, that would be ideal. I don't have any leather on hand, so I'm just gonna put some shop rags in there for the moment. And then, you know, I'll just close her until it's a little bit snug. You know, I don't want to crush the aluminum casting or anything like that. Just then we'll go to work on this outer race. Still have the outer fulcrum shaft bearings in here. So we're going to go ahead and try to knock those out. now we have this absolutely filthy, empty hub. Everything is out of it, except for the grease zerk right here. And this is the order things came out from outside to inside. This is the seal holder, bearing, spacer, and the race that the bearing rides in with the spacer tube in the center. Same thing on this side, only this side had, looks like all the shims on the inside of this bearing. So that's pretty much that with disassembly. Now I'm going to clean everything up and I'll be right back. Alright, now that we have everything cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and hammer the bearing races into the carrier. I'm going to go ahead and pound all 4 races in right away. Now that we have the races in the carrier, our next step is to go ahead and put the wheel bearings on. We're going to start with the outer wheel bearing. That's going to be the larger of the two. Fits into this race right here. But what we're going to do is we're going to put it on this hub right here. Before we put it on the hub, we're going to want to pack it with grease. Now that we have the bearing packed with grease, we're going to go ahead and drift it onto the hub. Nice and smooth. If you don't know anything about seals, the spring is always on the back side of the seal. Make sure you install the seal correctly. Got the outer wheel bearing on, got the seal on. Now it's time for the inner wheel bearing. Now that the bearings are good and packed with grease, I like to go ahead and just fill up the cavity in here. Once the cavity's good and filled up with grease, we're gonna wanna go ahead and tap that inner wheel bearing in. We don't wanna tap the inner wheel bearing all the way in. We wanna leave some room so we can measure end play and adjust with shims. Right there is pretty good where we have just a little bit of end play to work with. You're gonna want to take the seal. As you can see, we didn't tap the wheel bearing all the way in. We left a little bit of play here. In order to set and check our end float, we're gonna use a 150,000th spacer. Take the yoke. Go ahead, put it on. Now in order to tighten this correctly, we're going to need to lock in the back side of the hub, and I'm going to use a pipe for that. Torque spec on this is 100 to 120 foot-pounds, so I'm going to dial in at 110. Our next step is to measure end flow. You can use feeler gauges, but I like to use a dial gauge. Now we know our end play is 10/1000ths of an inch, and we want 2/1000ths of an inch preload. We're using a 150/1000ths spacer in the back. So basically all we need to do is use a 142/1000 spacer. Now we're going to get started on the outer fulcrum shaft rod with a nut on it. Clamp the nut down in the vise, leave a little bit of the nut sticking above the vise jaws. Spacer. Put a bearing on it. Distance 2. The hub. Now we want to put some spacers in there. We want to try to get a little bit of end flow. The next bearing. Another spacer. Now here's the thing. See, we don't have this in the wishbone yet. We have some room to take up. So you can just cut yourself a little spacer, made a pipe there. Throw the next nut on. Right now we have about 35,000 end float. Our target is 0 with a tolerance of 2/1000ths end float and 2/1000ths preload. Ideally we'll want to remove 35,000ths in shims. All right, I moved 30,000ths in shims just to make sure we're on the right track here. And we have about 5,000ths end float left. So now what we're gonna do is remove one 15,000ths shim, put two 5,000ths shims in, and we should end up right at 0. Finish off the outer fulcrum shaft. We're gonna go ahead and grease everything up. Pull everything out, making absolutely sure not to lose any of your shims that you just set up. Just like the wheel bearings, we're going to go ahead and pack these fulcrum shaft bearings with some grease. After you got bearings packed with grease, you're going to put this back together, making absolutely sure that you put your spacers back on. Start loading it up with grease. Now that I'm seeing grease coming through the bearings and I'm sure that the inner cavity is all filled up, it's time to put the seals in. Now I went ahead and pulled the spacer back out just so I can make sure that the seal goes ahead and seats correctly on it. I don't really like the stock 3-piece felt seals, so I'm going to use this 1-piece seal from National. You do need the spacer still. This is going to make sure that your seal stays off of your bearing. And you can just take the seal, push her in there. I got a 1 1/8 inch snap-on deep well socket. Take the spacer. Same thing on this side with the spacer. I'm not using a nylock nut right here. That's just because I had to take it apart and put it together so many times. When you do your final assembly, make sure you use nylock nuts, but we'll go over that in another video. So that's all for now.